Well, they are bad, no doubt about it. But those are nothing compared to this day, November 1st, 1755, which will go down in history as the most disturbing day in Europe's history. It was All Saints' Day, a Christian holiday where people would traditionally visit the graves of loved ones. So throughout the morning of October, the citizens of Lisbon, Portugal, went about their daily lives. They prepared the graves of their dead. They put up decorations, lit candles and said prayers. It was going to be a great day. And then suddenly, just after noon, the ground began to shake. At first, the tremors were minor and the people didn't pay much attention. They just thought it was a small earthquake, one of the many that have hit Lisbon in the past. But then the tremors got stronger and stronger until finally, with a deafening roar, the earth split open. In the blink of an eye, all of Lisbon seemed to disappear. Buildings collapsed, streets split apart, church towers crumbled, and thousands upon thousands of people were buried under tons of debris. People ran through the streets, screaming in terror as chimneys fell from the sky, furniture overturned, barrels rolled down the street, shop windows exploded, and trees were uprooted. In the end, some 10,000 people lost their lives. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare. You see, the earthquake that struck Lisbon was not a normal natural disaster. It was a monster, a real behemoth, measuring between 8.5 and 9 on the Richter scale. It was the biggest earthquake in European history, and possibly the biggest in the history of mankind. In fact, the energy released by this earthquake was 3 times greater than the energy released by the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II combined. So now let's take a moment to understand just how much energy we're talking about. Now imagine dropping a bowling ball from about 2 feet above the floor and then smashing it onto the floor. Now imagine doing that same thing, except instead of a bowling ball, it's a 10-ton weight, and instead of being 2 feet, it's dropped from 400 miles above the surface of the earth. That is how much energy was unleashed on that fateful day in Lisbon. Now I bet you can't wait to hear what happened next. After the earthquake struck, the people of Lisbon survived miraculously. Of course, there were still many fires burning, buildings still collapsing, and thousands of people had been killed or injured. But as the smoke cleared and the dust settled, the people of Lisbon began to explore the damage, and to their great astonishment, they found something unbelievable. You see, Lisbon sits on the river Tagus, which flows into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, because of the shape of the estuary, high tide and low tide are almost non-existent. However, as the people of Lisbon looked out over the river, they realized that the water had receded so far that they could see hundreds of meters of the riverbed that was normally covered in water. Some people even waded into the water and began to fish out the colorful pebbles and shells that lined the riverbed. They were so excited by this miraculous occurrence. Here they were in the middle of a disaster, but they couldn't help but notice the beauty that surrounded them. They took this as a sign that God had spared them and that He would help them rebuild their city. And then suddenly, just as quickly as the water had receded, it began to return, rushing back into the estuary with incredible force. Before anyone knew what was happening, a towering wave, over 100 feet high, was crashing towards the city. This was a tsunami, one of the deadliest and most destructive tsunamis in history. People fled in terror as the wave crashed over the city, destroying everything in its path. Houses were swept away, trees were uprooted, ships were tossed around like toys, and thousands of people drowned. The tsunami wave actually came in 2 parts. First, a wave 60 feet high hit the coast of Lisbon, causing tremendous damage, but that was only the beginning. Shortly thereafter, another wave, this one over 100 feet high, struck the city. This second wave was so powerful that it knocked down all the remaining buildings that had not yet been destroyed by the earthquake. Bridges collapsed, dams broke, and the entire city was in ruins. By the time the tsunami wave had passed, some 20,000 people had been killed, half of whom were foreigners who had come to Lisbon to celebrate All Saints' Day. In the aftermath, people wandered through the streets in a daze, not knowing what to do next. Homes, shops, and churches had been destroyed. People had lost their jobs, their savings, and their loved ones, but they were alive, and so they began the long task of rebuilding their city. But unfortunately, their troubles were not over yet. You see, as if the earthquake and the tsunami weren't enough, a few days later, a fire broke out in Lisbon, which spread rapidly through the city, destroying everything in its path. The fire raged for 5 days. finally being put out on November 7th, when it was finally extinguished. It became clear that the entire city was a smoldering ruin. By the time it was all over, some 85% of the city was destroyed. Over 100,000 people had been left homeless, and the economy of Portugal was in sharp decline. How did they rebuild? Well, you might have heard of the famous architect Haussmann who rebuilt Paris in the early 19th century. Well, he was given his job because of his outstanding work in Lisbon, which he undertook between 1755 and 1760. He laid out new streets, built new buildings, and created a new city plan, basically rebuilding the entire city from scratch. In the end, his work was so successful that Lisbon became one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, as you can see in these old paintings. But despite all the progress that had been made, Lisbon never truly recovered from the earthquake and tsunami. Before the disaster, Lisbon had been the cultural and intellectual capital of Europe. It was home to some of the greatest artists, writers, and scientists of the time. But after the disaster, people simply didn't want to live in a city that was constantly at risk of earthquakes and tsunami. In the end, Lisbon was never able to regain its former status. And although it is now one of the most popular tourist destinations in Europe, it will forever be remembered as the place where one of the worst disasters in human history occurred. But wait, before you leave, I've got a question for you. Which event do you think was the worst in the history of Europe, and why? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're down there, don't forget to subscribe for more amazing videos. Now check out this video on the mysterious Roman emperor who vanished from history, or watch this video instead. Come on guys, please pick one. Come on, please pick one.